So let's kick it off. Hey everyone, I'm joined here by a very special guest today. His name is John Lindberg. I hope I pronounced that right, John. And
You're fine.
John is a multifaceted individual, but he's a bit of a specialist in risk communication and also radiophobia. Um, and we're going to be discussing this topic and a bit about what John does as well. So welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so my name is John. As you say, I like to keep myself busy. I am the public affairs manager for the World Nuclear Association, which is the international trade body for the global nuclear industry. And we're based here in London. Alongside that, I also do a PhD on nuclear and radiological risk perception and communication at King's College London and Imperial College. And only really to make sure that I keep really busy, I'm also doing my health physics degree at the University Hospital in Gothenburg in my native Sweden. Um, my background is first and foremost in politics. I once dreamed of becoming a doctor, but then I realized that I couldn't stand blood. I had to try to draw blood of myself in the school experiment, almost fainted. I was like, okay, becoming a doctor, clearly a bad idea. And ever since, I've gone into the sort of the world of politics. I've a background in the Scottish Parliament as a political advisor, short stint in the European Parliament, and as an advisor to the UK government on nuclear. I think that's really my background in a nutshell.
Wow, no, that's amazing, and I'm so glad you keep busy, and you're into so many different fields and subfields, which is super interesting, John. John, I know, I watched your TEDx talk, which was how I found you on YouTube, and I was really impressed with that talk, and you focused on nuclear energy and I have a background in nuclear engineering, very passionate about nuclear as well. Consider myself a nuclear advocate. And one really important point that you hit in many of the articles you write, and basically the risk perception. And I think that might be more of a human thing as well. Like the perception of risk. For example, when you go ride your bicycle down a road, the chances of you being possibly hit by a car, the chances of you driving your car down the road and getting into an accident and losing your life, or a nuclear power plant accident, the risk of that, or the chances of you winning the lottery and risking your money. So, could you talk a bit about risk perception and how our society views risk?
Yeah. So, I mean, risk perception is incredibly complicated field in the sense that it is a projection of the human mind itself. And that's also what makes it such a fascinating topic. The way that we make sense of the world isn't really as rational as perhaps philosophers have tried to make it seem. And up until a couple of decades ago, in terms of economics or whatever have you, this notion of human rationality was sort of center, that everything we did was rational. But the problem is that we're obviously not rational. We are first and foremost driven by emotions, by mental shortcuts, by experiences, imagery, um, memories. And because of this, we will inevitably view certain risks different from others. You mentioned bicycles. Bicycles clearly carry a much higher risk, especially if you live in London. It is actually suicidal to put yourself on a bike, yet there are, plenty of people riding a bike to work. Whereas a nuclear power plant accident with fatal outcomes, the risk of that is so insanely small. Yet people fear nuclear, whereas cycling is good fun. And this comes down to a number of different psychological factors. One of them is that humans actually are really useless when it comes to dealing with statistics. We have a tendency of putting too much weight, for instance, on events that are insanely unlikely to happen. Nuclear accidents clearly is a prime example of that. We also have this great tendency of assuming the worst case scenario. So let's say nuclear accident happens. The likelihood of you dying from it is, let's say, 1 in a million. But the way that we make sense of the world, we think that we're going to be that one person out of the million. Um, and then the thing that really does come across when it comes to risk perceptions on nuclear is sort of the imagery that we all carry with us. When we imagine nuclear accidents, we clearly think something which resembles nuclear war. And there's plenty of field work that confirms this. When they've done interviews with people asking, okay, so there's been a nuclear accident, what does that actually look like? And the way that people describe the imagery, it is very, very, very similar to what the imagery that came out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, obviously we know that nothing could be further from the truth. Look at Chernobyl, Fukushima today. Yes, it's deserted, so nature is reclaiming what used to be cities. But that's obviously very different from the aftermath of a nuclear war. But it isn't then surprising that people fear something that they cannot see. Radiation we can never see. We have to construct the reality that becomes an interpretation of radiation. We have to have Geiger counters. We have to have big maps with different colors representing different risks. But this is this is a risk that's been created by humans. We measure a certain dose rate and we say that this dose rate is high and dangerous, whereas this dose rate is low, that's not dangerous. But what we've failed to do is that the dose rate the experts are saying is dangerous, which the general public, which probably doesn't understand much about radiation, they have to trust these scientists. But these doses, they might exist naturally somewhere else. But we don't have that context or that perspective. For instance, I grew up in a part of Sweden where there is an absolute ton of uranium in the ground, which means that the background dose that we get, mostly through radon gas, is really, really high, especially because in Sweden, we love building basements. And because it's damn cold, we isolate our houses really, really well. So where I grew up, when the government came and wanted to measure radiation in our basement, the readings were off the charts. But we didn't know anything about radiation. And the parts of Sweden, parts of Finland, and many other parts of the world where the doses are much higher than, say, in the aftermath of Chernobyl or Fukushima. Yet there's plenty of people living in southern Sweden, but people have been told to never move back to areas around Fukushima that has lower radiation. And that just speaks to this sort of disconnect, this dissonance that clearly exists. And again, the general public will perceive radiation risks much higher than experts, and that's sort of part again of this skewed perception, which again makes it very, very fascinating, albeit quite frustrating to research.
Absolutely. No, it definitely does sound fascinating, especially how we interpret certain things that we don't understand. And yeah, you're right. Radiation is something that you can't smell, you can't taste, you can't hear, you can't feel. So it's something which is very, very, our senses cannot detect it. So naturally, almost like a supernatural force, we we fear it in a similar sense, like a ghost or like some sort of a demon.
Yeah, I
Now,
mean, because we can't see it, we have to rely on the mental imagery that we have with us, and
mhm,
most of this imagery comes from popular culture. And if you watch stuff like HBO's Chernobyl, or my favorite, the China Syndrome from 1979, it isn't surprising that people fear it because popular culture has done a damn good job of making it seem really scary.
Absolutely, you're right. So you make that connection between popular culture and our mental imagery, what we paint in our minds. And you're right. It is a pretty powerful force. Media and how it has shaped our reality or shaped not reality in a sense or our own personal realities. So you mentioned, so John, I know we had a really good conversation in the summer, and you mentioned your goal of changing hearts and minds, and I love that because I think as an engineer, as a nuclear engineer, someone with a very very technical background, sometimes we only focus on the mind itself, changing the mind, and we don't focus on the heart. And I think that's the key to actually spreading awareness and educating people. It's through emotions. It's through a change in hearts and minds where people can really understand something like radiation. And how, tell me a bit about your journey in developing that and learning about how to change hearts and minds.
So I think a lot of this actually comes from my background in politics, because it became clear to me very, very early on in my political career that facts are important, but only really when the facts align with whatever the politician wants to do. So if the facts are inconvenient, then other alternative facts will probably be found to make sure that that fits the narrative. And I think that's something that hit me hard, because I mean, I came from a more technical background before I made the swap into politics. So at that point, I was still more comfortable with the laws of nature and hard facts. But unfortunately, facts will always be secondary to perception. It is as simple as that. And that's why, for me, as long as we turn the heart, the mind will follow. Um, and in the nuclear debates, that's so clear. Because the nuclear industry has for decades spent, we're talking about hundred billions on giving information to the general public, because the problem is that many still believe that people are ignorant or stupid, or they clearly don't understand the facts. So what we need to do is to give them the facts and educate them. And as soon as we've educated them, then they will see the light and understand that nuclear is clearly really good, or nuclear technologies generally are very, very beneficial. But again, the problem is, and the evidence speaks very strongly to this, that if this approach worked, then we wouldn't have faced the issues that we're facing today. It's as simple as that. Because at the end of the day, as I said earlier, we are emotional creatures. Um, as anyone that's read the work of Daniel Kahneman will know that about 95% of the way that we make sense of the world is intuitive, it's based on emotions, is based on mental shortcuts. There's only really 5% that is the sort of deliberative, like the rational part of the brain. Um, and if you're spending all your time on those 5%, you're not going to get very far. Um, so politics taught me in a very hard way that perception is king. I remember very vividly having dinner with a future boss of mine who became a very influential member of the European Parliament on all questions around energy. And he said, "Look, John, personally, I think nuclear is really, really important. But the problem is that there are no votes in it. It is, if not the ultimate vote loser, it's not far from it." So he said that if you want me and other politicians to be able to sell nuclear, you need to make sure that people understand that waste isn't really an issue, that the linkage between nuclear power and nuclear weapons isn't really there, apart from the imagery itself, and the nuclear accidents aren't as bad as they seem. Um, in order to do that, again, we've tried the facts approach, didn't work. So we clearly need to go through the heart. And the heart is working on emotions and on imagery. And the problem is that virtually all imagery that exists in the nuclear debate is really bloody scary. You know, it's anything from once again the wasteland following a nuclear accident. It's the barrels of nuclear waste from The Simpsons. There's a liquid green goo, or to run with the Simpsons analogy, the three-eyed fish, Blinky. That is what people think about nuclear. And no wonder that people are going to be a bit, hold on, what the hell's going on here? If it's not resulting in the wasteland, it's going to result in these barrels or in three-eyed fish. Well, this seems a bit fishy, doesn't it? So that is really the charge for the nuclear community. We need to start to build that new mental imagery that is positive. The people, when they think about nuclear, they think about, well, nuclear, that's pretty good because that leads to clean air. Nuclear leads to a more futuristic society that we all want to dream about. In the 1950s, we used to say, well, we're the nuclear powered society. By the year 2000, we're going to have flying atomic cars. And now in 2020, I'm looking around and thinking, where the hell is my flying atomic car? But it's stuff like that that we need to get better. We need to, and a lot of nuclear engineers might not like this, or might be more uncomfortable with this idea. But we need to perhaps be comfortable to put some of the facts aside. We need to be anchored in facts. We can't go completely mental, but let's dream a bit. Let's be a bit creative. Let's be slightly starry eyed. And I think that way, half of these predictions are clearly not going to come true. But let's dream because we will get really, really, really good results if we dare to do that. Because, humans, we like to be inspired. When President Kennedy set out the vision for the Apollo program and, let's go to the moon in a decade, America rallied behind that vision. And 9 years later, we landed the first man on the moon. The nuclear industry has a lot to learn from.
Absolutely, no. I completely agree with you. I think um, I'd really agree with the fact that the heart, once you change the heart, the mind will eventually follow. And it's powerful with your background in politics, where you see that, hey, listen, these facts are actually secondary to emotion, right? And
Yeah.
and it's quite like shocking to learn that for someone with a very academic or technical background, that it kind of shatters them in a sense, because they think, oh wow, I've dedicated so many years, and sometimes people with PhDs, decades of their life, to a cause. And just learning that this is secondary to actually emotions. It helps us it helps us really understand what we are as humans. And that's really interesting. For example, in the world of nuclear advocacy, there was recently a Brazilian model. You may have seen her TikTok video, and she made a
Yes.
really interesting video where she basically showed that, hey, listen, the amount of waste that you produce in your lifetime through nuclear fits in a soda can, and energy density of nuclear energy. And I think that was so effective. Like, we need more influencers like YouTubers, or whether they be models, TikTok models, or folks that can really influence on that personal level. Tell me about the role of influencers and how they can really influence our society going forward.
So I absolutely love the work that Isabel's been doing. She is taking the nuclear messages, she's taking nuclear science and completely reinterpreting it. She chucks out decades worth of conventions about how we should talk about nuclear, and I love it. I think it is absolutely spot on, and we need more of it because influencers or advocates or whatever you want to call them, they speak to different audiences, and I think that is something that is so so important. We need to essentially stratify our messages and be our messengers, because one size fits all clearly doesn't work out, never works. Someone like Isabel is going to work really well in some audiences, and we should use people like her as much as we possibly can in our nuclear advocacy. And then we have other sort of environments where that's going to be less efficient, and but the other people are going to be more effective in those environments. So I will never be the TikTok model. Sorry, those aspirations are clearly not going to come true. I also know that I'm probably going to be slightly more effective with certain policies, given my background and given that I am one of them in some senses. So it's understanding getting the right person in front of the right people at the right time with the right messages. And that is something that takes time to find out. It's a lot of trial and error, to be honest, finding out who is the right person, and what are the right messages. But what I detect in sort of the broader nuclear environment is that we have begun that journey towards stratifying our messages. There is a lot to be done, to be honest. We focus a lot on climate change. Climate change is really important. Don't get me wrong. One of the key reasons I'm in nuclear is because of the role in climate change mitigation that nuclear can play. But nuclear isn't everything. Sorry, nuclear. That is a Freudian slip. Climate change clearly isn't everything. Nuclear can do so much more. And I think that sometimes those messages get lost or become secondary to climate change. And part of that is, I think, was at least my thesis, is that part of the movement, the pro-nuclear movement, has internalized a lot of the sort of critique and the sentiments that a lot of the people that either used to be or still are anti-nuclear hold. And to a lot of these people, climate change is the number one priority. So I think that subconsciously we talk so much about climate change also to try to win over those more hardcore of our detractors, which I probably think is the wrong way to go, because about 25% of the population is always going to be pro-nuclear. About 25% of the population is always going to be anti-nuclear. That's not really going to change much in either direction. There's really the sort of the grey middle, the 50% that really isn't really caring too much either way. Those are the ones we need to focus on. And to them, climate change is important, but equally, if not more important, to these people might be jobs, for instance. With the global pandemic, the economy is clearly it's taking a battering and it's going to continue to take a battering. People are losing their jobs. And unfortunately, if you are unemployed, or you find yourself in a job insecurity situation, thinking about the next month is going to be so much more important than thinking about 50 years from now. It is as simple as that. And that's once again why the nuclear messages have to be reflective of the environment that surrounds us. And again, that's probably, again, we are seeing some of those non-climate change messages starting to come out a bit. I think we need to do so much more on that. And again, we need to be confident in what we are saying, because just because we don't talk about climate change doesn't mean that climate change isn't important. It's just that there's so many other attributes to nuclear. And again, in a policy environment, unfortunately, there's a disproportionate amount of policymakers that are skeptical about climate change, or indeed might be arguing that climate change isn't really happening. To these people, we still need to have these people as our allies. Some people will be really uncomfortable with this, but I think we need to be realistic enough to understand that we cannot cherry pick. So even if there is a climate change denying member of parliament that's pro-nuclear, we should still engage. But obviously, a climate-centric message isn't going to work. And that's, again, another reason why we need to make sure that we branch out our messages.
Yeah, I really like how you mentioned, in terms of nuclear advocacy, we really focus on climate change. And one thing that, because it's the biggest pretty much biggest issue right now in terms of human worldwide crisis. But there are a lot of other benefits like radiomedical isotopes, right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, Many facilities across the world, especially in Canada, the CANDU reactors produce cobalt 60, produce molybdenum, which is Moly 99, which all radiomedical isotopes that save millions of lives across the world. Sterilization of medical equipment, and a lot of technology that's even helping fight COVID in a sense. So there are a lot of interesting benefits to nuclear, which nuclear advocates may not always pick up and kind of start spreading.
Okay.
What would you say? Like, I know each message has to be catered and to a specific audience in a sense.
Yeah.
What would you say is the best strategy for nuclear advocates? Like, what strategy should they use? Let's start off with your family, then let's start off with your broader neighborhood, and then let's go to your city and state and overall country. What small actions can we do that can provide that long term change?
So I think it's really important to just highlight again that for us, the work in nuclear or are considering ourselves nuclear advocates, nuclear is clearly our bread and butter. Most people, it is not. It's understanding, just to have stated that, it's understanding that there's a time and there's a place for it. And I'm guilty of this myself. Most of my friends are like, John, can we please not talk about nuclear again? Getting that balance right? Um, but as I said earlier, stratify your messages, understand your audience, and most people know this. Understand your audience and tailor accordingly. Understand that most people are not really going to be interested in the page in and page out of a long report. They will want something that is easy to digest. I'm personally a huge fan of short videos or infographics. So it's taking this awesome science, it's translating it into um, you know plain layman's terms. We don't need to sound fancy. We just need to get the message across. Again, I know a lot of people, myself included, sometimes are guilty of wanting to show off a bit and use a bit more technical language. Again, counterproductive. Um, and translate it into everyday terminology. So I talk about bananas, and I'm not the only one talking about bananas when it comes to radiation. But it helps to sort of visualize and to put things into context and into perspective. So I think that's really, really important. Nuclear is really impressive. But the problem is sometimes that this sort of nuclear exceptionalism, that we think that we are a special case in many cases, it gets a bit in the way. We are, at the end of the day, an industry, like any other. Most people aren't really interested in industries. So again, it's bringing out the positive messages, and you can start that with your family or your local community. Um, Again, I grew up in a environment which has a lot of radiation. We also had a disused uranium mine just up the road, which was originally going to be used to fuel the nuclear power program in Sweden. For a number of reasons, it never came to be. So, but in my local community, nuclear power was associated with this mine. So the mine now has a big lake. In the lake, rumor has it, the fishes are growing abnormally large. And again, that's a hook. It's finding these hooks to making it relevant to people. For me, when I talk about nuclear back in my local village, that is one hook. That these fishes, these monster fishes that are really normal fishes, you know, this was going to be clean power fuel. And if we want to, we could reopen the mine, and we could power Sweden for years to come. And you start to bring these sort of positive connotations. Um, And I think that's important, and I think that advice works regardless if you're talking to your family, the local community, more regional level or national level. Find people's hooks and use them. And again, facts important, but facts not everything. Emotions are. Find those positive messages and reinforce them.
That's really great advice, John. Focusing in on those positive messages and really driving that home. Um, Sorry, a bit of an echo. But what I want to say is that you're right. Like I've been in your shoes where families kind of like, hey, Osama, just quit talking about nuclear for once, right? And I think it's keeping that balance in a sense, right? Like there's like a specific time and place for certain things.
Yeah.
Um, you're right about that. I think one really interesting message that I remember from my childhood is watching television in Ontario,
Yeah.
60 to 70% nuclear. And I used to see this commercial and it said nuclear is clear. And it spoke about how nuclear energy has prevented smog days. And when I was a
Yeah.
kid, I used to correlate nuclear with Simpsons and, something that's dangerous. And I was so
Yeah.
shocked and confused. I'm like, how is this commercial on mainstream TV? Like, nuclear is horrible. And how is nuclear clear? And
Yeah.
that commercial still sticks to my mind till today. Like, nuclear is clear. And the play on of words, that really stuck in my mind. So just finding those messages that stick, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like in the nuclear community, we're in the defensive, right? At the moment, we're really in the defensive and we're really like almost like apologists, like kind of like defending this industry and saying, hey, listen, it's not this dangerous and this and that. How can we flip the narrative? How can we like immediately, well, not immediately, but flipping the narrative of taking a position of superiority, taking a position of positivity. Um, could you talk about a bit about that?
So yeah, so my first, second, and third message, it will always be, for God's sake, stop talking about safety. This industry has a great tendency of always wanting to tell everyone in the world just how safe we are. Don't. It's not working. On the contrary, you invite people to start thinking about all the horror stories that there is about nuclear. You bring to people's minds these really scary images, of birth defects and whatever not. Just don't. Just please stop talking about safety. It's as I said, if it was going to work, it would have worked decades ago. It clearly hasn't. So let's move on. And I think that's also actually why I'm personally a bit torn about climate change, because there is evidence that suggests that if you link nuclear power with climate change, it at best builds what's called reluctant acceptance. Because let's face it, climate change is bloody scary. The way that climate change is being phrased in the debate is nightmare inducing. So connecting nuclear, which already has some really negative connotations, with climate change, this other great, really scary thing, I really don't see how that's going to work in our favor.
Reluctance,
And
acceptance. Could you go into more detail about that?
so yeah, so people, survey work has found that people reluctantly accept that we might need a small part nuclear because they perceive that there isn't any other alternative out there. But the problem with that is the narrative that is surrounding renewables at the moment is sounding very, very hopeful, that 100% renewables will do it. But the problem, as most of us know, is that unless you are endowed with a great number of rivers, um, which a few countries are, but most countries are not, you are not going to be able to do 100% renewables all the time. The sun sets, the wind doesn't always blow. You will need backups, and batteries are never going to cut it. So then it falls to natural gas, which clearly isn't low carbon. So people are reluctantly accepting that nuclear might have to play a role, but that role is minor. And I think the longer that the narrative around renewables, which is very cocky, um, the longer that narrative is allowed to exist unchallenged or isn't challenged in an effective way, um, nuclear is going to lose out in this sort of narrative battle. Because if you look at survey work, renewables are scored really, really high. High 80s, low 90s in terms of the percentage of people that have a favorable opinion of either wind or solar. Nuclear is nowhere near that. And that's probably part of the problem, because when we think about wind and solar, we think about a clean future. We think about a more hopeful future. And there's been a great number of absolutely brilliant ads that is sort of extolling the importance and the virtues of renewables. And again, nuclear, we aren't doing that. We are, and I think you really hit the head on the nail by saying we are on the defensive. We are apologizing for existing. We are like, oh, I'm really, really sorry, but we are clean, and we are safe, and we can really, we might be able to help. No, we are nuclear. We have a brilliant product. What we can do, we can truly change the world. And these are the reasons why. And by doing that, by really showing, being unapologetically pro-nuclear and bringing out these messages of hope, we can, turn the ship around and start. And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. It's getting the positive images about nuclear out there, because the first 10, 50, 100 times, people are not really going to pay attention to them more than, oh, nuclear. Well, I thought nuclear was pretty bad. But, maybe the 101st time of hearing this message, people would be, yeah, you know what? Nuclear clearly isn't bad. I'm starting to warm to the idea of, when I flick the switch, the electricity that comes is nuclear. Well, that sounds like a pretty darn good deal to me. And again, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a slow process, because people have been fearful and skeptical about nuclear since the sort of early 1970s. That's 50 years. We're not going to turn that around in 2 days. But if we're not starting now, we're never going to turn around. And I think that nuclear is really at a crossroads now. Either we turn the ship around and we sort of build this positive image around nuclear, and then I think nuclear will really play a key role in building not only a low carbon future, but building a truly sustainable society globally. Or we fail and we don't really challenge these misconceptions, the lies, and we don't really create a new narrative. We don't take charge of our own narrative. And then I think the nuclear energy is going to become more obscure, as the time goes on.
Absolutely, you're right. I think you definitely hit the nail on the head. Where past 50 years, since 1987 or Chernobyl, the nuclear industry has these misconceptions, and it's pretty much a negative perception from majority of the world. And we have to pretty much make up for that time, right? Where it's been negative for such a long period of time. And I think just looking at Hollywood or even Netflix shows, where recently this new show, it's called The Queen's Gambit. I don't know if you've watched it. It's a game. It's a show on chess, and as a result of this show, it just recently got launched. You see an exponential rise in the popularity of chess. You see the chess just like stagnate and then go all the way like to tens of thousands of percent of chess popularity. People are buying chess, people are playing chess because now chess is cool, right? And the difficulty with nuclear is, I think what what we're trying to do here, the treasure chest in a sense is make nuclear cool. Okay, and what we're doing now is not working, unfortunately. But what can we do to make nuclear cool? Like, what is like the golden ticket to make this industry, this technology, humanized, first of all, and also something trendy, like like the Tesla car. Um, what are your thoughts?
So I think the first step on the journey is make nuclear boring again. I think that's where we need to start.
Hmm.
We need to make sure that nuclear isn't the sort of exceptional power source, because at the moment we're exceptional for all the wrong reasons. We are exceptional because of the exceptional health risks. We are exceptional because of the exceptionally high costs, or for the exceptional delays when it comes to construction. So we need to stop being exceptional first. We need to be like everyone else. Because once we sort of get up on equal footing, then we can really start to build this sort of, make nuclear great again, whatever you want to say. And I think part of that is that nuclear industry needs to get better at delivering, the promises it's making. Um, we are promising the earth. We're promising that we will be the most cost effective, that we will be, built really quickly. It's not going to cost very much. Yada yada yada. But the problem is that a lot of, not all, but there are some projects that are clearly not doing that. This is common to most sort of large infrastructure projects, but nuclear has somehow become sort of the poster boy for this. So I think delivering on our promises is an important start. And again, if we ditch the sort of the safety fetish, again, we sort of start to normalize nuclear, because there are plenty of examples out there where new technologies, when they come, they are feared. We were terrified when electricity first came. It was the work of the devil. It was going to electrocute people. It was going to cause the greatest of societal upheaval. And now, if we think about life without electricity, most of us would, feel sort of a cold dread straight away. So clearly, electricity became normalized, and nuclear. We've had a good run at it, but since the 1970s. So I would say that nuclear's bad reputation came long before Chernobyl. It's really in the 1970s when the sort of the links between the bomb and the reactor was created, by using radiation as a sort of intermediary. Um, so I personally think that we need to really get the conversation around radiation right. Because once we get the conversation around radiation on the right keel, we will find a lot of the other issues, be it cost, be it time delays, will sort of follow. Because clearly, and it goes back to what we spoke about earlier, the dissonance between the risk that people see from radiation that comes from a nuclear reactor vis-a-vis natural background radiation. And the nuclear industry, again, has got it completely wrong in many ways. We talk about radiation risks in isolation, and you should never talk about risk at all in isolation. You need to put it into perspective and into context. And, yes, radiation doses at the really low doses that we're talking about in most of these cases, they might theoretically increase the risk of, say, getting cancer. It increases the risk of getting cancer by about 0.000000001% in many cases, um, which for most people is terrifying, because they think, okay, I am now more likely to get cancer. And I bet, well, most of us are terrified of cancer. Most of us, at some point in our lives, had the sort of cancer scare. feeling, oh God, there's a new lump. Is that cancer? And we can't stop ourselves because we have this really old fear of cancer. But again, that sort of 0.001% increase needs to be put into context. And that context is that, or into perspective, that the likelihood of getting cancer is about 50%. So the increase is negligible. It's insanely low. So we need to start to talk about these risks into the perspective, and it's something that I've spent a lot of time talking to radiation protection officials and the RP community more broadly, trying to get them to understand just how important it is. We need to stop this idea that we can one day know exactly how dangerous low dose radiation is, because we won't, and it isn't relevant. Is it, a really tiny increase of risk, or is it a no increase, or is it even slightly beneficial? It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. But the day when we get that conversation around radiation right, the benefits are going to be huge.
Wow, no, it's really interesting listening from a radiation specialist like yourself. That in the nuclear community itself, there's a huge debate over whether or not low doses of radiation are whether positive or actually beneficial. And I think you actually hit like a really good point that listen, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right? Like this conversation is something that is counterintuitive. In a sense, it's good for someone that's deep into research and PhD and postdoc, but for the general public, this is a counterintuitive argument and conversation, and one that shouldn't even be started, right? Because it does more harm than good.
Oh,
Um,
totally.
yeah.
It's like, so a couple of years ago I really got interested in the low dose debates. I spent so much time looking into, or is it a hormetic effect, i.e. that a very small dose of radiation might actually be positive, i.e. it protects your body from other negative side effects, or is it a threshold, i.e. that beneath a certain dose nothing really happens. But then I had an absolutely brilliant conversation, or a number of brilliant conversations with Professor Jerry Thomas at Imperial College, who now happens to be my PhD supervisor as well. And she was like, "Look, at the end of the day, I don't care, because the effects are going to be so low that you will have to bring out your magnifying glass, and if you're lucky, you might see something, but you won't, because we swim in radiation. Our bones are radioactive. The air we breathe is slightly radioactive. The ground we tread is radioactive. Space bombards with radiation. Radiation is everywhere. And our body knows how to deal with it. When life occurred on the planet all those billions of years ago, the world was much, much, much more radioactive. So if life didn't know how to deal with radiation back then, life would never have survived. But here we are. So we spend too much time on it is splitting hairs as far as I'm concerned. So I've completely disengaged with that debate, because we can't measure it. In order to actually measure it, we would have to go around and give people a very small radiation dose. And we're talking about giving small radiation doses to maybe a couple of million of people. And best of luck getting ethics approval going irradiating people. So we can never find out. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. So the nuclear industry needs to stop obsessing with it, and regulators really need to stop obsessing about it as well.
Absolutely. Wow. No, that's really interesting because in the nuclear community, I've always seen these debates go around, and I've been a bit curious as well. I'm like, hey, listen, like, it's pretty interesting, like the data, and is it beneficial? But at the end of the day, it's those hair splitting arguments that are counterintuitive and that really hold that this whole argument back. And what's interesting is that one example of this whole nuclear dilemma that I can kind of paint is actually something that relates to me is growing up with the name Osama, right? And that's like Chernobyl, right? Like 9/11 was like Chernobyl, right? And it kind of,
Yeah,
in a sense, like the media painted with a broad stroke certain type of people, the Muslims,
yeah,
and certain skin color and certain name. And here I am. I actually grew up in Canada during 9/11. I was a kid, and it was pretty brutal, right?
yeah,
And but what I learned was when I got into this industry, the nuclear industry, I'm like, listen, this industry has the same problem that I grew up with my whole entire life, right? And I found that just the general public, they had these misconceptions about Islam or Pakistanis or whoever, right?
yeah.
But when I made that personal connection and I was able to communicate, certain misconceptions away, um, it was so effective. Whereas I see other people that are part of my community who, in the same way, bring up hair splitting arguments, and like they get into the technicality so deep into the faith, where the hair splitting arguments kind of pass people's heads because they don't care, right? And it's effectively communicating those high level but very important concepts that actually drives home the conversation. So
Exactly.
yeah, like I kind of draw that comparison. Like, do you have like a comparison in mind that you can relate to when it comes to nuclear advocacy?
I mean, it's hard to beat that one because it's just absolutely perfect. No, but you're absolutely right. People love getting in, and given that most people in the nuclear industry are engineers, and I'm impressed. It's like the stuff that you guys do. It's I would never understand it. But as you say, it's the high level concepts. What people really care about is the question: is it safe or isn't it? Simple as that. Um, and it's I suppose an admittance of failure on my part. But every time I see my darling granny, she's like, John, can you? I know you're working nuclear, but could you please go and work for literally anything else? I don't care if you go selling weapons on the street. Just please don't work with nuclear, because for her, nuclear. I mean, she remembers Chernobyl really really well because Chernobyl, the accident itself was first actually detected outside of the Soviet bloc in Sweden. So she remembers people being terrified of the clouds and of rain. That because it was going to rain, it was going to rain Chernobyl. Um, and I suppose that's a failure on my part for not have being able to make her comfortable with what we do in nuclear. I clearly haven't been able to answer that fundamental question for her: is this safe? Um, but what I would say, and this is more, I suppose, more advice to anyone out there that work at a nuclear facility, is that if you come across anyone who is clearly uncomfortable with nuclear, you know, tell them that I go to work here every day. My family live around here. If this was as dangerous as everyone seems to believe, do you really think I would live here with my family with potentially kids? Because I find that, and this is what others have told me, that that's an incredibly potent argument. Um, because then again, you make it personal, because I think that is so important. And for me, it's honestly one of the reasons why I spend so much time on researching radiophobia, because I remember traveling in Lithuania. Some of my dearest friends are from Lithuania, and I traveled there with them, and I had the great fortune of meeting some of their family members and grandparents and so on and so forth. And eventually the conversation came up. So John, what do you do? And it was explained to them that I work with nuclear, and you could just see this sort of curtain down, like, oh, nuclear, right? So Chernobyl, because they remember Chernobyl not only because of the accident itself and the stories, but what they remember is that a few days after the accident, all of a sudden the authorities came knocking on the door saying, right, you have 1 hour, pack a bag, you'll be gone for months. That's what they were told. And a lot of predominantly men were essentially put on a bus and driven from Lithuania all the way down to Ukraine to act as liquidators and to clear up the mess at Chernobyl. And they did their service, came back, and they came back as wrecks because they had no idea how much radiation they'd gotten. They were terrified because they clearly didn't trust the Soviet authorities, um, who said that they hadn't gotten a dangerous amount, but they didn't trust them, and the sort of fatalism kicked in. And time again, I heard the stories of people that either took their lives, uh, brought on by radiophobia, or they de facto drank themselves to death to try to cope with the sort of anxiety that they experienced after the experiences at Chernobyl. And for me, these stories were so incredibly potent. And for me, they just hit home why we need to really normalize our relationship with radiation. First and foremost, because this human suffering, and these were some just individual stories, and there are plenty of them out there, following especially Chernobyl and Fukushima, stories of depression, of anxiety, social stigmatization, bullying of kids that were evacuated, people that are dealing with substance abuse to try to get rid of the anxiety, suicides, unnecessary abortions. These are immense tragedies that we need to avoid. And we can only do it by normalizing radiation. Because what I'm afraid of is that we are not going to normalize our relationship with radiation soon enough. And as with anything that is man made, there will be another nuclear accident. There will be. It's inevitable.
It's inevitable. Yeah.
If we, and if we fail to normalize our relationship, we're just going to repeat history. Because we clearly saw after Fukushima that we haven't learned any of the lessons. We did the same bloody mistakes. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that's really interesting how your experience traveling in Lithuania really brought home that topic of radiophobia and how actually how much it's actually there in society, right? And the impacts that it can have at different levels of society, even at a mental health level, right? And I, reading your articles online and seeing your content on YouTube, I think that really is a strong force in really spreading awareness because for example, on the YouTube search engine, which is actually the second most powerful search engine, second to Google, if you type in nuclear and then you type in TED Talk, your video is one of the first that shows up. And it's actually one of two or three. I think you and I think Michael Schellenberg. That's about it. And I think we need more people on YouTube, on different platforms, voicing that message. And what I really want to get into, I know it's a bit late on your end, is I really want to get into your passion of mountain climbing and especially like in the background you see base camp. I don't know if you took that picture, Mount Everest. Did you end up climbing all the way, and how far did you get up?
So I most certainly did not climb all the way up. So I did the trek from this little airport called Lukla all the way up to Mount Everest base camp. So the altitude where we sort of turned around was 5,545 meters above sea level, which is plenty high. At that point you definitely feel the altitude. Walking those last 3 kilometers that we did from where we were staying over to base camp, 3 kilometers took 3.5 hours, mostly because of just the lack of oxygen. Um, but again, I think my passion for nuclear comes from my passion for nature. So as I said, I'm a very keen hiker, and an aspiring amateur mountaineer. Don't really think Everest is ever going to be my goal. It feels a bit too steep and too expensive.
It's like seventy
Sixty thousand
thousand.
dollars. Yeah, it's insanely expensive. But for me, it's like walking through the valleys of the Himalayas and seeing the glaciers that are shrinking year by year. For me, that is just incredibly potent and motivating in why I work with people. Because I want to preserve these environments for future generations. For me, the Himalayas is one of the greatest wonders of nature. And at this rate, the Himalayas is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world when it comes to climate change. So if we don't take urgent action now, you know, we are going to see huge devastation of some of the most pristine environments on the planet. Um, and for me, that would be we can't let that happen. Simple as that.
Absolutely, you're right, and I'm glad you somehow linked your hobby into your vision for how you would like to see the planet. Have you been to the Himalayas, and like what mountain do you want to climb there? What's your goal?
So my fountain final goal is climbing. There's a summit about 50 kilometers away from Everest called Shoyu, which is one of the 8,000ers. Um, Slightly less difficult than Everest. Because for me, and I will sound like such a mountain snob, apologies for it, but for me, Everest has become just too commercialized.
Yeah,
Anyone can just buy themselves a spot on an expedition and do it. For me, that isn't part of why I'm doing it. I don't want to have to stand in line like I'm standing in line to take the tube to work. I want to for me, climbing these mountains into the death zone where humans are not meant to be, for me that is the ultimate pilgrimage and to pay homage to Mother Nature. You are pushing and you're pushing yourself beyond the limits um, to see these extreme environments that very few people have ever seen, and that sort of raw beauty that you see there, and that's why I love mountains. Up there, you get perspective. You understand that at the end of the day, we humans we are so tiny, and if Mother Nature really, if she not want us there, we are not going to be there. But equally, it's terrifying to understand that we, these small human beings, have such an impact on the environment. So that's the goal. I'm hoping to return to the Himalayas for my second expedition next year. Going to Annapurna, just up the base camp, or potentially a place called Mera Peak, which is about 6,500 meters high.
that's awesome. No, that's a great goal, and I love your perspective. I personally I haven't been on a mountain that I can remember. I may have I may have not known if it's a mountain or a hill, but but I think you're right. Just seeing that view from a mountain and understanding if you're in the Himalayas, an avalanche can come anytime and destroy you. Like mother nature is truly powerful, and we've, in a sense, with nuclear technologies and other many other interesting technologies producing energy, we've controlled, in a sense, nature. Or you know for example, the nuclear fission process, it does occur naturally as well, and we've put that into our hands. And now we're, as we've discovered radiation, that is something that is natural. It is something that is part of nature. And I think it's your mission at the moment to help spread awareness and help us understand what that is without developing a sixth sense, which none of us really have.
Not
So
quite.
I think it's a great journey, and I think it will be very, very positive for the whole world to understand more about radiation and overcome radiophobia. Absolutely. So it was a pleasure chatting, John. I really enjoyed this discussion. Do you have
My
any?
pleasure, everyone. It was a good, jolly good time.
Absolutely. Do you have any last words?
Well, I was going to say, nuclear is absolutely brilliant. With nuclear, we can truly build a stronger tomorrow that is, equitable and it's going to bring out the best of all of us. We just need to be comfortable with taking a step to the side, reflect on our failures, accept that we have failed in many respects as a community, but to build on that and build that sort of shining success, because nuclear energy is the most intelligent way to build that sort of better tomorrow. Um, and if we come together as a nuclear community, the sky is truly the limit. And that is so cliche, but I genuinely believe it, and that's the case.
Awesome. I love your vision. I love your optimism, and I think having that vision and having the optimism is actually what develops a path forward for an industry. And I think you made some great contributions with the World Nuclear Association to the nuclear industry, and always a pleasure chatting with you, John. Thank you so much. So for the viewers, anyone that's interested, below in the description below will be John's video that he posted on TEDx. And John, if you have any articles or details that you would like to send me, I can include those in the description below as well, uh, so that the viewers can know how to contact you.
Jolly good.
Great. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.